Fellow South Africans, fellow Africans, it's really my great privilege tonight to be able to speak about this beautiful continent, a continent that we all love, a continent that is so diverse, a continent that is incredibly rich. A number of years ago, the famous magazine, The Economist, issued a statement to say Africa in its cover would be the dark continent. And at the time, I looked at the headline and felt highly offended by the prospect of this beautiful continent. Yet, as we look around in these days, it is fast becoming harder and harder to realize that Africa needs to be able to change its course in order to avoid living up to that headline. I deliver tonight's address looking at the fact that the African Union needs to do better. We need to be able to build a prosperous continent. We need to, in the next number of years, as our population bulges to close to over 1 billion citizens, do better about moving the poorest people to middle class. The Africa I dream of is an Africa that can use its resources, its people, its minerals, to be able to build a continent that is much more inclusive, a continent that does not discriminate on ethnic or tribal lines, and a continent that is a home for this beautiful population. But in order to do that, we have to think harder about what we need to do. And this address occurs well within a context where I believe a few institutions have failed. Starting, in fact, with the African Union. The African Union failed the people of Malawi in 2019. They went ahead and affirmed an election and declared it free and fair. But when you look at that particular election, no one can deny the fact that it was an easy choice to make to say this is the path to least resistance, rather than confronting an authoritarian state that in fact had failed to do its basic duty, which is to uphold the right for every citizen to express their right to vote. It was in fact at the Supreme Court of Malawi that the people, had it not been for that, we'd still not have a legitimate president in Malawi. How do you use Tipex being used on voting station results and accept that as a free and fair election? And I'm grateful that that Tipex election has been overridden, and now it is my great honor to be able to congratulate my friend Lazarus Chakwera as now the president of Malawi. But the African Union has been on trend. It is now, as we sit here today, ignorant of the incredible threat that is taking place right down our doorstep in Mozambique. As these terrorists grow in confidence and in experience, what is to stop them from attacking a landmark like Sandton or like any other big mall in order to demonstrate the fact that the conversation about terror isn't a conversation that Africa should be ignorant of. It is a conversation right on our doorstep. There's no denying the fact that just north of Limpopo, we face another massive crisis. A regime there that only a few years ago thought that it was experiencing change under now President Emmerson Mnangagwa, now is starting to become more and more trends of a government that lacks accountability, isn't willing to uphold human rights, and more seriously, as in this particular area, journalists are being arrested, and it is clear the fact that no one in the leadership of the African Union and certainly in the SADC is willing to stand up to big man politics. The lack of accountability in this particular continent will be the very demise of democracy. It will be the very thing that undermines the right of citizens, whether in Zimbabwe, whether in Eswatini, whether in Mozambique, whether in the Tanzania, where we're seeing, in fact, that there have been some significant attacks even against the opposition there. Fellow Africans, I think we cannot take it for granted that as the Kenyans so affirm that at first we must be liberated and then we must liberate ourselves from the liberators. Because if we fail to do that, the very same liberators fast become dictators. I would urge the African Union needs to do better with Zimbabwe. Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa has made the country an undemocratic space. I can remember all too well having to host members of opposition who were exiled from their own country, from their parliament. It is now recent the arrest of Hope Mill for reporting on COVID-19 corruption. That indeed is a symptom of what is a draconian move. The arrest of Jacob Ngiravuma for organizing a peaceful protest was a demonstration that arresting those protesters is nothing different from what we're used to seeing from President Mugabe. The arrests of Titi Dangarembwa and several other peaceful protests can be nothing less than described as a Hitler move. Fellow Africans, the threats that in fact were issued on Tuesday have been issued to the people that Mnangagwa is issuing are things that we cannot accept. This acts as a rogue government, calling civilians dark forces, describing ZANU-PF and anyone who opposes it as the enemies of progress in Zimbabwe. This cannot be something that will stand. This is not the sacrifices that so many made to ensure that this continent is free. The idea that they will now criminalize any form of criticism of the state is one of directly dealing decisively with democracy in Zimbabwe. We know one thing, is that nations that are free, nations that are democratic, tend to prosper and have economic conditions for people to succeed. We know when dictators rise up, even as others have said, benign ones, you end up with economic downturns that not only add to the hardships of citizens, but continue to oppress people further. This is not the story of Africa we want to see. And turning to here in South Africa, we were all told that our president would bring a new dawn, that President Ramaphosa is a great man, that it was someone who had studied under Nelson Mandela, who demonstrates ethical and compassionate leadership. We've been told here in South Africa that we're going to experience a new dawn. Well, I would urge we need to be able to prove it. This is a time now not to be able to adopt the quiet diplomacy of a number of years ago, but actually a stance that says we cannot tolerate what is taking place in Zimbabwe. We cannot be sending envoys to Zimbabwe who get told that they cannot be able to meet with the opposition. That is a clear demonstration of partisanship. But at its core, it speaks to this central issue, that when liberation movements who are national by orientation and nationalists, they tend to not only turn to become dictators, but they mobilize citizens on the back of their own race or tribe. Eventually, any opposition is criminalized. I want to call on the leadership of South Africa to say, whilst I celebrate the fact that here in South Africa, the media is still relatively independent, that our courts remain free of any interference, that more than anything, anyone can criticize the government, we must make sure that those same values and rights are things that fellow African citizens enjoy. That we must charter a new path. That from the age-old silence in Africa, if South Africa is going to lead a journey forward, we need to be stronger on human rights. For ultimately, President Nelson Mandela said it best. He said our foreign policy must be built and must be based on the protection of human rights and ultimately the promotion of free trade. Our history as a government has not been great. We saw the fact that our courts had found against this government when it failed to act against Omar al-Bashir. If we're going to have a change of stance, South Africa must restore its position of leadership in the continent. That's not just an easy role to play. It is an important role because the success of South Africa is indeed and holding up of human rights can only bode well for our continent. So if that is the case, I make my first appeal to our President Ramaphosa to say to him, more than anything, you cannot be silent anymore, sir, on Zimbabwe. For if you are silent on Zimbabwe and silent on atrocities that are taking place there, history will also cite you as one who stood with those who oppressed their people rather than those who cherish the values of freedom and liberty and a future for all. You, sir, have been tasked with an incredible duty as the chair of the African Union to ultimately restore Africa as a bedrock and as a home for human rights for all citizens. South Africa has a crucial role, and it's a role that South Africa must play forthright and must be one that we pride ourselves on. Having known what happens to repetitive cycles of nationalism, we can break that and ultimately build a safe Africa, an Africa upon which rights are protected. This would be a great moment. This is an opportunity for us to stand up to big men, to oppressive regimes. It's time that we ultimately demonstrate that leaders like Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, who treats Bobi Wine as a punching bag, a 75-year-old who has been in power for 34 years and still wants to remain in office. This is indeed an opportunity to set a powerful example for Paul Biya, the president of Cameroon, who has unleashed violence on his own people. And Biya, as an 87-year-old man, has been the president now only for 38 years. When leaders do not set an example about how we can see democratic change, they capture the state, and this is a true trend of many liberation movements, and we have to fight against it. There is a pattern becoming here. And we have to make sure that those who stand in the corridors of power for decades and think that they're entitled to rule forever, we have to break it. That is not what democracy is. That is not what freedom is about. Mnangagwa is 77. And he has been right next to Robert Mugabe since day one. And it's been 40 years. He still thinks of himself as the king of Zimbabwe. The people are sovereign. Their sovereignty has been captured by a violent regime, and we certainly cannot stand by idly. And that's why I put my voice behind Africans who say Zimbabwean lives matter, as any other lives, as the lives of so many in Zambia, in Mozambique. Those lives matter, and we need to be at the forefront of that fight. It was clear when you look at even the Kingdom of Eswatini that it was allowed to be the chairperson of the SADC, a region that is already still an authoritarian leader who violates human rights on the Swati people. We continue to see the harassment of Martin Sizwe Dlamini, who is a prominent journalist in the Kingdom of Eswatini, and his family. Many journalists and activists, our whistleblowers, continue to be victimized for their hard stance on corruption. Africa cannot continue to have a space where the media is captured for the benefit of only a few people. This is a big task. And I believe that we can reimagine the Africa we want to see. This is why, as One South Africa movement, really believe that Africa needs to develop its better days ahead of it. And the first is, in fact, let us all stand together and condemn any xenophobic acts. This, particularly in our region, I was disturbed like any other when I saw headlines during the week that said our problems emerge when foreigners enter our country. That it cannot be so. Our problems are because of an incapable state. And what we need to do is reformulate how we see immigration, how we build an integrated Africa that trades well together and allocates visas for all citizens. We need to build an economic policy that says that rather than having just only an Africa Free Trade Agreement, but that we build a fund that is able to develop infrastructure in Southern Africa, and that infrastructure be enhancing to trade. When we do that, we can actually be a bargaining partner for many of the global markets. As we've all been in lockdown during COVID-19, there can be no doubt that as our currency has begun to devalue to rates of 17, 18 rand, that this is a great opportunity for us to enhance intra-trade within Africa. Because indeed, a strong Southern Africa is good not only for the world, but it's good for our continent. And I want to say, the sooner Southern Africa not only develops an integrated economic policy, it will be crucial that equally so, it develops a format upon which it can hold leaders accountable. I will recall when I went to the nation of Senegal and sat with leaders in the East Africa region, and back then, or still now, the president of the Gambia. It was a truly inspiring story that when the Gambia had its own democratic transition where one leader remained in office and refused to accept electoral results, the ECOWAS region stood together and fought and said, if we need to take any and all means, we will stand up to dictators. Now last week, the SADC met, and I am, like many Africans, deeply disappointed that nothing was said about the atrocities that are taking place in Zimbabwe. Our trade policy, our human rights culture must be upheld, and accountability must be something that we build down. One South Africa, one Southern Africa speaks to the fact that all of us collectively can find a way where citizens can work together. That if we're going to break down and build a new headline for The Economist, which says that the next decade is for Africa's to win, we can indeed reformulate our economic policy, build democratic accountability around human rights, and furthermore, ultimately ensure that when trade occurs, we condemn xenophobia and we ultimately demand that no leader is able to mobilize on the basis of tribe, culture, gender, or any biological facts, that we can build a truly prosperous Africa. I truly believe that indeed when we look forward, and I call upon even embassies here in South Africa, particularly the European colleagues who have not spoken up on this issue, that it is time to stand up together. We can restore that vision that Nelson Mandela had of a truly prosperous Africa. And this future is ours, in a continent where many young people are bustling, and many young people, a young continent, with leaders that are coming up. We can build capable states, capable economies, and a prosperous Africa. This is what we ought to be fighting for and standing together on. I thank you.